What is the worst case of I know better than my doctor you've ever heard of? That recent couple who had a malnourished 7-month-old who decided that their kid was gluten intolerant and so never gave him anything besides crap like quinoa milk. They owned a health food store and were health nuts. Also, anyone who came in and saw the sickly child commented, but they brushed it off and didn't seek help. Drove to a homeopathic doctor across the country who sent them to a hospital, but they apparently decided to drive back home first. Baby died before they got to the hospital. Autopsy revealed the child was severely dehydrated and the stomach had been empty for days. Weighed about 9 pounds at it, which is just slightly higher than a newborn. They knew so much more than a doctor that they decided not to go to a doctor. Reddit point: I woke up to this blowing up. Sorry for the long wait. I'll post the news article below, but since a lot of us are rightly sickened by the story, here's the outcome. The judge gave them 6 months suspended sentence after determining that they didn't willfully neglect their child, and you can't charge them for murder just because they are stupid. I beg to differ. The parents say they tried unsuccessfully to feed their child, but it fussed with the bottle and breast milk, and so they concluded their baby must be lactose intolerant and also gluten intolerant. Instead of getting actual doctors involved, they felt confident enough in their self-diagnosis that their baby had an eating disorder to continue giving the baby quinoa milk and the like. They didn't notice anything wrong with their baby after that, except now the child causally having severe trouble breathing. After visiting the homeopathic doctor, they didn't make it fast enough to a real hospital. They live in Belgium, which isn't exactly huge, but I'm trying, unsuccessfully, to leave my opinion out of it. Interesting to note, a prayer card was tucked into his diaper. Prayer in quinoa, folks, that's all you need. If your baby was fine, why do you need a prayer card? I'm so furious. Also, thank you all for the comparison to your own baby weights. I too know a lot of 9 pounds newborns, so I can't imagine how sickly her looked. Witnesses say he looked shrunken and grey. Probably me. I've talked about this before, but I'll share again as sort of a sap. I was addicted to a drug called Mercindal, which contains a relaxant plus codeine plus paracetamol. It started at 2 tablets a day, then 4, then 8. After a couple of years I was taking 40 plus a day. I thought all the warnings about don't take more than 8 a day were stupid. I was all, I take 40 a day so I'm fine. I went to hospital for an unrelated issue with my eye and they freaked about how much paracetamol was in my system. I lied and said I took heaps due to pain in my eye. They tested my liver and it was inexplicably fine. From there I realized just how close I was coming to death daily. I had built up a major tolerance, but generally 40 plus paracetamol is enough to kill 2 people. It's insanely lethal. It took me another year to give it up and have researched it a lot now. People think Panadol/Tylenol is harmless. It's not. People take heaps, wake up fine, and think they're safe. In reality, overdose symptoms don't appear until you're literally dying, and there's nothing they can do to save you. You have a 24-hour window to have your life saved. Even if you build up a tolerance, it doesn't mean you're safe. I'm the exception to the rule. TLDR, was addicted to a drug that contained paracetamol. Thought warnings on the packet were stupid. They are not. Tylenol/Panadol/paracetamol, or whatever name you know it as, it's insanely lethal. Read the packet instructions and do not deviate. You are not a doctor. Reddit. I want to add that paracetamol is called acetaminophen in the US. Also should say that I'm 3.5 years clean. Saying clean sounds weird because I've always been so anti-drug. I don't even like weed much. Legal medicine can sort of blindside you. Caught me so off guard. It started as what does it hurt for me to take a couple to get to sleep? But the more I took, the less they worked as my tolerance got harder. I fell in love with them basically. Then taught myself to fall out of love. Stay safe, Reddit. Here's a kind of backward situation. Top edit. The family doctors in this story are nurses, so not actual doctors. They did go to medical school though. My bad for the confusion. Edit. Seriously dudes. I made a mistake. Calm down. All I know is that they're nurses and they all did 6+ years in medical school. Not sure which ones, cause I never cared to ask. I get that I shouldn't use nurse and doctor interchangeably. That's all on me. But holy shit, you're laughisty. About 6 years ago I scratched my face really badly and it got infected. I was put on a sulfur medication for 14 days and that was that day 1. Felt weird. Mother asked the doctors in my family and they all said it was normal. Day 2. Extremely uncomfortable. Same response. Day 3. Ended up going on a flight. When I got off I was throwing up tons. Doctors said it was because of the flight. Day 4. No longer wanted to eat anything. My stomach hurt too bad. Period started without warning. Day 5. Constant pain. Period heavier than ever. Doctors told me it was just a heavy flow of my period. Day 6. I'm begging my mother to let me stop taking the medication and to let me go to the actual doctor. She calls the doctor in the family again and they conclude I'm just being dramatic. Day 7. Refusing to get up. Have gone through a box of tampons in 4 days. Downing Advil and the other over-the-counter painkillers like it's candy, as well as chugging NyQuil to help me fall asleep. Day 8. Slept the entire day away in a drug-induced slumber. Was told I'm just being lazy. Day 9. Doctors told my mom to take away the Advil and NyQuil. She did. Spent the rest of the day just sitting naked in the bathtub because I was bleeding through pants and tampons like crazy. Mom and doctor still think I'm exaggerating. I never let my mom into the bathroom. Was just trying to brush it off as bathroom issues. Day 10. I throw up blood. A lot of blood. Mother finally agrees to take me to the hospital. I'm immediately rushed in and given a blood transfusion and have my stomach pumped to remove any traces of the sulfur drug. I had a severe allergic reaction to the sulfur which caused my blood to stop clotting. Hence the period. A normal platelet number is 150k to 450k. Mine was down to 10k. I was on the verge of bleeding out and any injury cold caused serious damage. Now my mom doesn't understand why I never listen to the doctors in the family. I don't care if they know what they're doing. Obviously they can't understand over the phone. Also listen to your kids, damn it. If they say something is seriously wrong, don't immediately assume they're faking to get out of something. Edit. Just gonna mention that my mom wasn't trying to neglect me or anything. I would cry wolf about being sick a lot back then because of my depression. I was also supposed to go to a family event, hence why I was on the plane and was notorious for getting sick when I had to do stuff like that. The doctor in the family was also my grandma, so my mom trusts her a lot. Aunt also chimed in, but it was mostly my grandma. Also it was 6 years, almost 7, ago, not 4. Recently found a pic of me in the hospital bed with the date. I was 14/15 when it happened. Super edit. My mom is not a bad parent. She's made mistakes, sure, but the amount of people calling her neglectful and a horrible person is honestly sickening to me. This woman has stayed up night after night looking after me when I was suicidal and does everything in her power for me. I love her so incredibly much, and even if she made a mistake in the past, I don't blame her. Like I said, I was constantly crying wolf about illnesses for years. Even now she still goes way out of her way to care for my uselesses, and if it wasn't for her help, I would've committed suicide years ago. It's hard to understand the situation if you were not there, and trying to make you guys understand would take hours. Since you are clearly hellbent on labeling my mother as a demon, call me anything you want, but don't judge my mother over a mistake. Hey, are you surprised? It's another edit. Okay Reddit doctors, stop trying to diagnose me. I had doctors that could see me do that. It was an allergic reaction to the drug, which caused thrombocytopenia, low platelets, but in low doses it only causes hives and itchiness as well as my throat closing up. It was the large dosage that caused such a dangerous autoimmune response. I doubt we still have the hospital papers, but I can always take a look when I have minute. As soon as the sulfur was clear of my system, I was fine, though I felt weak for a while afterwards and had to stay home to avoid injury, just in case. My brother-in-law has chronic back pain and regularly goes to a chiropractor for it, and apparently said chiropractor also works on my Bill's neck. After one chiropractor appointment, my Bill experienced severe weakness to the point where he could hardly get out of bed. At one point, apparently, he collapsed and had slurred speech. I, an RN, was like, dude, get thee to the hospital, because that sounds like a stroke. At the time of this conversation, I was also hanging out with another nurse who used to work in neurology, and she agreed he should see a doctor as soon as possible. He was like, nah, my chiropractor's a doctor and knew about it and said it would go away. He's very much an alt health kind of guy and thinks stuff like vitamins and coconut oil will cure anything. I remember looking after this one guy who came in post myocardial infarction from the cath lab. His blood pressure, BP, was sky high. Patient denied any major health issues in the past and he only took supplements. I called the doctor about his BP and doctor ordered some antihypertensive pills. Before the patient took them, he ranted about big pharma and how drugs don't work and that if he were just allowed to go home to take his usual herbs or whatever, he'd be fine. Judging by the fact that his BP refused to come down after the pills and required an fourth nitroglycerine infusion, his ECG showed signs of left ventricular hypertrophy, typically caused by high BP over time, and the fact that he had a massive heart attack showed me that his heart problems had been brewing for a while, and, as expected, his herbal supplements were doing squat. My granny. She is the most maddeningly religious person I know, but I love her to bits. She was recently hospitalized because she felt exhausted for a few days. Given that she's 75 and obese as all hell, it was worth the hospital stay. The doctors told her, so you can't be released. Your blood pressure is so high that you could literally have a stroke right now. Also, have you been treating your diabetes? She said no, because I don't have diabetes and I'm taking natural medicine for my blood pressure. I was in the room and basically went, wait, back up, you have diabetes and you knew about it and chose not to say anything, and you're taking witch doctor bullshit for blood pressure? She basically gave me this look that read, yes I am, and I don't care what you think. I promptly got every goddamn member of my family packed in this hospital room to guilt her into taking actual medicine. Honestly, I think she lies to us when she says she is taking it. I've been mentally preparing myself for her death for a while now. TLDR, my granny thinks faking holistic witch doctor bullshit will cure her blood pressure and told a doctor that she doesn't have diabetes. Edit. I feel I should add the next day I bought all her nurses and her doctors a box of Linda chocolates, as well as 3 more to put in the break room for the rest of the nurses and doctors. They were in for a bumpy ride, but I wanted them to know I appreciated them immensely. Here's one where my mom was right. I was in 5th grade and was consistently vomiting, and the right side of my chest was always hurting. Also had a high fever. My mom took me to our doctor and he told her I had a bug and to just make me rest and drink lots of water. I have a low pain tolerance, so everyone assumed I was just exaggerating how badly I was hurting. After sleeping as much as possible and drinking so much water I was practically pissing clear. I was still vomiting a lot and my fever was consistent. Also still had chest pains. My mom called the same doctor and he gave the same advice, rest and drink water. My mom says my lips started turning blue the next day and she took me to the ER. My right lung had completely collapsed. I was in the hospital for 10 days with pleurisy. I'm glad my mom finally stopped listening to that doctor and I didn't die. To be fair, the odds of my lung having collapsed at 11 years old were slim to none. The doctor was just doing his job, I think. Until a few years later, when he tried to take my dad off his thyroid medication and told my dad to buy herbal supplements from the doctor's wife. My mom reported him to the medical board and we switched doctors at that point. Okay, so I interned at the district attorney's office, prosecutor, this past year. Sovereign citizens are always a great delight, because they don't cite law and basically just make up nonsense. Some even submit briefs as counter-plaintiff. Even if you don't know law, you know this is wrong. The guy was pulled over for a minor violation. I think his brake light was out or something, but reeked of marijuana, so they arrested him, without going into the elaborate details. He was smart enough to not completely abandon the public defender being there to help him, but midway through a question he quite literally said he knew more law than everyone in the room. Yes, the judge was on the bench. Edit. Because sovereign citizen stories are funny, the one who cited counter-plaintiff by page 30 started rambling on about natural law and how he was a natural person while his birth certificate is his corporate name because he doesn't capitalize the letters when he writes it. By page 45, if the judge would have accepted his argument, the sheriff could have shot him, and cited the judge's ruling just seconds before. I wish I had the brief and could share it with you all, because it was golden. It starts out citing law and making a relatively sound argument, wrong, but logical. Then again, every sovereign citizen brief does. They often cite the exact same law as well. But the longer they go on, the more they deteriorate into complete madness. Me. Starting at age 16, I had severe stomach pain every now and then, particularly after I ate a big meal. The pain would double me over. I didn't want to be touched. Every time I'd go to the doctor, I'd be told it was gas pain or menstrual cramps. For 5 years, this carried on. I was researching my symptoms and had a pretty good idea what was wrong, but when I told them my suspicions, I was brushed off. I was only 21, too young for what I was suggesting. Finally, I was told I was seeking pain meds, and I wouldn't be seen anymore for my stomach pain. I've never taken pain meds for anything, due to opioid addiction being a huge part of my family history. I didn't ever want to take the chance. 1 month later, I had a fever. I was throwing up. The pain was horrible. I called my doctor. He refused to see me, but recommended a good psychiatrist to talk to. After that phone call, I laid down, and my fever rose. I was rushed to the ER, and if you haven't guessed my problem yet, I'm about to tell you. I had gallstones, and had for a while, and my ER trip revealed that my gallbladder was infected due to a stone being lodged in the duct. I needed surgery and I needed it ASAP. I lodged complaints against the doctor that refused to treat me, explaining that he didn't take my concern seriously. He eventually moved his practice to another state. I hoped he became a better doctor. So I know this is a bit backwards, but it'll probably get buried anyways. So here goes. Back in the second semester of my first year of university, I started to notice something was off. I was having bad stomach aches, my hair and skin went super dry, I randomly gained 10 to 15 pounds, which at 5'2" was quite noticeable, and I was exhausted all the time. Literally I could get 10 plus hours of sleep and wake up out of my mind tired. Finally, when it got to the point that my friend in calculus had to wake me up from nodding off literally 6 times over the course of one 50-minute lecture, I decided I'd had enough. I got him to help drag me over to our campus clinic and got on the list to see a doctor. A couple hours later, I'm in an office and explain everything to the nurse and then again to the doctor. He asks me a few basic questions about my lifestyle, when my last period was, etc., and says we'll do a blood test and see you in a couple days. Blood test happens. He tells me it comes back normal, but he wanted to do it again. So back I go to the clinic to get poked. Yet again, the results come back normal. Lather, rinse, and repeat for a third time. Now, through all of this, I'm still experiencing all the same symptoms, and am in no way, shape, or form the functioning human being I previously was. It had been a month and a half, and I was tired of being poked and being told everything was fine. What does this guy want to do? Of course, run a 4th blood test. I lost it. I asked him, do you think it will show anything different? He goes, if it's what I think it is, it might. I reply, I'm done with mites. I'd like to know what the next step is in regard to diagnostic options. His solution? An abdominal ultrasound. Okay, at least it's moving somewhere away from what has gotten us nowhere so far. But I was curious. What was he looking for / did he expect it to show? Turns out, the dickhead had decided that as a first year, newly legal, and single female living on her own, the only solution was that I had gone crazy with my promiscuous ways and must be pregnant. Despite the fact that I was on birth control and had had 3 blood tests done with negative results, he was convinced that I was just early enough, that the hormone level hadn't built up enough to be detected in my blood. Luckily, I live in the land of the Great White North. Yay, universal healthcare, but still, I ended up getting the ultrasound anyways, partly to prove him wrong and partly just in case anything else showed up that this idiot would otherwise not tested for, and sure enough, guess who wasn't pregnant? Everything else looked normal too, so I gave up and didn't go back. A week or two later I had a 4-day weekend and flew back to my home province. My mom took one look at me and drove me straight to my childhood family doctor's office. By the time I was ready to fly back for school 4 days later, I had been diagnosed with an autoimmune disease that had become severe due to being allowed to go unchecked, had a treatment plan in place, and finally felt for the first time in months like I wasn't crazy. How did they diagnose this, you ask? A simple blood test? Turns out it's amazing the amount of information you get back when you aren't only checking the box for pregnancy tests to be run. I spent 10 years dealing with extreme pelvic pain and heavy bleeding. It started out as bad periods and ended up getting to the point where I was bedridden with pain from the waist down and couldn't do anything myself. My boyfriend had to help me take showers and get dressed. I'd soak through a Super Plus tampon and overnight pad in an hour or less. I kept having ovarian cyst ruptures. I had chronic back pain. I couldn't have sex because it felt like being stabbed. I kept gaining more and more symptoms and became suicidal. I was taking oxycodone, hydrocodone, and 800 milligrams of ibuprofen every 6 hours and was still in pain. I went to over a dozen doctors and they all told me I just had bad periods or needed to lose weight, and some straight up told me I was exaggerating the pain to get attention or drugs. It was routine for me to go to the earth or fourth painkillers during bad episodes because the pain would leave me screaming in bed. I started doing research and joining online support groups and narrowed it down between a few diseases and would bring them up at my appointments to see if there was a way to screen for them. My doctors would ignore it and test me for diabetes and thyroid issues instead, even though I didn't have problems with either. I finally found a doctor who diagnosed me with PCOS and endometriosis and performed a surgery to remove the endometrial adhesions and a very large ovarian cyst. He also suggested I try Nexplanon. It's now been a year and 3 months since my surgery and a year and 2 months since getting the Nexplanon, and my symptoms are drastically reduced. I don't get periods. I haven't had a cyst rupture since my surgery. I'm able to live a normal life and might become an assistant manager at my job. I rarely have pain days, and if I do it's nothing compared to what I used to have every day. I suffered with progressively horrible symptoms for a decade and was treated like shit by so many doctors, only for one doctor to drastically improve my quality of life in the span of 3 appointments. Sometimes people are wrong and should listen to their doctor, but sometimes doctors are wrong and should listen to their patients. All of the bullshit I went through could have been avoided if I had met a compassionate doctor sooner. I once worked with a patient who had total placenta previa, where the placenta sits on top of the cervix. What that means is, because when the woman goes into labor the cervix has to open up, and the placenta has to get torn open. For that to happen there is a lot of bleeding. A crazy large amount. It's really fairly manageable these days though. You have to make sure they are close to medical assistance, so if they do go into labor they can get help and book them for an early C-section to try to avoid them going into labor. This lady however wanted none of it. She insisted staying in the deepest darkest countryside, 3 hours from the nearest hospital, and she insisted on a natural birth and just said she would come into hospital when labor started. I can understand not wanting to move, but it wouldn't have been all that for her. She just would have had to stay with her parents for a bit to avoid, dying. This was explained to her repeatedly, trying to get her to change her mind, but she wouldn't budge. Then she went into labor at 37 weeks. By some massive stroke of good fortune she went into labor at the supermarket in town, just after going to an obstetrics appointment, so she happened to be only 10 minutes away. She still bled so heavily that she arrested on arrival at the hospital. She got an emergency C-section while she was dead, then a hysterectomy along with God knows how many liters of fluids and blood, and by the skin of her teeth managed to survive. You know what her line was on leaving the hospital? Well, my way turned out alright in the end, didn't it? This wasn't exactly something I heard, but experienced myself. To give some backstory, a couple years ago during my junior year of high school, I started experiencing sporadic pain and swelling in my left ankle. Sometimes it wouldn't even be noticeable, other times I was writhing in agony wanting to cut the whole damn leg off. We decided to go to this little walk-in clinic that had opened recently in our town. to see what the problem might be, only to be asked by an awful excuse for a doctor if I was exaggerating to get out of taking my finals for that year. This was obviously not the case, as I was in clear pain and my ankle was visibly swollen. We left the place more agitated than anything else and looked for other ways to fix it. Not too long after, I decided that enough was enough and that I was going to the hospital to get this looked at. Some worrying x-rays and a couple trips to the Vanderbilt Hospital in Nashville later, and we discovered that it was actually a Ewing sarcoma tumor growing inside of the bones in my ankle. Fortunately, and somewhat miraculously, we caught it in its early stages, which almost never happens with that kind of cancer. I survived cancer. If we had taken that doctor's advice at the walk-in clinic, there is a good chance that I might be dead or dying right now. Funnily enough, she was no longer employed there by the time my parents were able to raise hell with the place, so I guess her bullshit finally caught up with her. Shortly before the second time in my life I dropped out of college, I was having a lot of issues with insomnia and anxiety, so I went to my doctor. For some reason, I ended up taking an AD test first from a psychologist, which I saw through the test and it proved inconclusive. I kept insisting for more answers that weren't adult AD, so we talked about the difference between antidepressants and anxiety medication. She wanted to try some anxiety stuff first, I guess because it is gentler and they are neurologically different. I don't know these things. So I did that. Without going into my sleep history too much, I ended up taking the medication for 3 days before I realized I hadn't slept at all since I started taking the medication. I thought this isn't normal, even for me. But the only thing that's changed in the last 3 days is. So I immediately ceased touching the drug, don't remember its name, and hoped for the best. I didn't sleep a wink, a moment, or at all, for what would end up being 213 consecutive hours, before I finally slept for 4 hours midday. Over a week later I never went back to my doctor after that. Incidentally, about a month later I had a eureka moment with a counselor, decided to drop out of college a second time, and move 1400 miles away, and I've slept nearly every night since. Literally over 2 decades of insomnia disappeared overnight. Lessons. Anxiety is powerful and crippling. Medications can fix you, or mess you up. Losing sleep that long will mess you up. TLDR. Doctor prescribed anxiety meds for insomnia. I didn't sleep for over a week. Late to the party, but I'm someone with autism whose mother thought vaccines would make it worse. So my life was at risk and she somehow thought that was okay, because I could have been like the kid around the corner who didn't speak apparently. I tried to get all the vaccines when I turned 16 and again when I went to uni at 18, and I was ill for weeks, which messed up some important exams for me. I also broke my finger when I was little, and it's still out of place to this day because she said there was nothing wrong with it. Broke my wrist doing gymnastics and she just let me cry and not sleep for a week with how much pain I was in. Couldn't have pain meds cause that was bad for kids too, and then was so annoyed at me that she called my dad, separated, to take me to the hospital because she couldn't deal with me anymore. Had to have a cast on for several months and she just laughed when we got home. Same woman also hit me so badly when she lost me in a park. I was maybe 4. My memory's not great of that day, that my grandparents took me to the hospital and she refused to go with them because what were they going to do? And they'll only blame the parent and make things up. Edit. We'd be here all day if we go into how I wasn't allowed to see a psychiatrist for my mental health issues because she was worried that they'd falsely accuse her of being the problem. 1 psychology degree later, and I fully agree that she is the problem. My mother. She's severely disabled, but refuses to listen to me or her doctor, or concede to being disabled. She had a bad fall down the stairs a while back that broke her, well, pretty much everything. Broke her shoulder, hip, 3 ribs, a vertebra, forget exactly which, and cracked her head open, with bleeding in her brain. Thankfully, she's still semi-functional after all that, as in, she can walk to the bathroom by herself, but she seems hell-bent to drive herself into a grave as soon as possible. She can hardly walk, can't stand for any length of time, is legally blind, because of the head injury and still continues trying to do all the things mothers do. Cooking, cleaning, taking out trash, etc. I constantly have to babysit her because she's too damn stubborn to admit she's disabled. She's given herself several new fractures since the initial fall from doing shit she's not supposed to. Broke her foot, gave herself a compression fracture in her spine, and recently broke a rib walking into a door, just to name a few. Despite all of this, she vehemently insists that she is, quote, fine apostrophe. She also has osteoporosis, and it took a ton of arguing from both me and her doctor to get her to take the meds for it, because she's also very anti-medication. She finally broke when her doctor's patience snapped, and she said something to the effect of, listen, lady, your faking bones are melting. To give you an idea of the sort of person my mother is, she once walked herself to the hospital after falling and breaking her tailbone. I don't even understand how that's possible. Not exactly an I know better moment, but it kind of applies. So my father is an orthopedic surgeon in Texas, and he deals with a lot of backwards, absurdly obese people pretty much daily. And one day, this extremely large, ballparking around 300 to 350 pounds, woman came in or with a completely shattered foot. I mean, that sucker was turned into powder. Apparently she flipped an off-road side by side and got her foot crushed under it. My dad absolutely hates operating on ankles and feet. He likes hips and knees, so he was dreading this surgery. It took about 30 to 45 minutes to do whatever doctors do, perform miracles, and he believes he's done with it for now. The patient gets released sometime later and then immediately decides to get back on the side by side. I bet you can guess what happens next. She rolls it again and crushes the same ankle, which fucks up the screws and rods in her leg, keeping everything in place. She shows back up and gets operated on and gets her now meat ground ankle all patched up again. So a few days later, my father receives a legal notice with a ton of paperwork citing what he's being sued for. So he defends himself in court and gets sent to the Texas Medical Board, knowing full well that he's done nothing wrong and this Einstein is the one who faked up. But the case gets closed and he was found negligible by 2%. Or 5% or something. I don't know the rules. I'm not in the medical field, because she was booked back into the hospital within a certain amount of time of the surgery. So he got a strike on his license and now has to go to the medical board every 6 months to prove he is capable of being a doctor, all because of one idiot. TLDR, some fat lady broke her ankle four-wheeling, got it fixed, then broke it again on the same four-wheeler, sued my dad and got him in trouble for no reason of his own. The lawyer can look at the judge, look at the plaintiff, then look back at the judge and say back quote, "Are you cheating me, Chris Porter?" I'm a nurse. I won't go too far into detail because of laws and stuff, but I did have a case where I had a patient who had sleep apnea. For those that don't know, sleep apnea causes a potentially deadly heart arrhythmia called atrial fibrillation, where one part of the heart flutters 4 or 6 times faster than the rest of the heart. During this, a blood clot can form, break off, and said blood clot can travel to places where it shouldn't be, resulting in stroke, heart attack, or pulmonary embolism. One of the treatments of sleep apnea is to lose weight, another is to use a CPAP machine to assist in breathing at night. And for those not in the know on sleep apnea, it's where you stop breathing in your sleep for sometimes several minutes, your oxygen drops, and you can cause heart and brain damage. Anyway, patient loses like 100+ pounds at the urging of his doctor. After he has started on a CPAP to help with the sleep apnea, suddenly he's not feeling well, ends up in the air with a full-blown Wadowmaka heart attack. I'm talking to him and finding out about his health history and hear about his weight loss. He said, "I lost so much weight I even stopped using my CPAP." I then asked if his doctor told him this. His reply, "Nope, I just figured I didn't need it anymore because I'm at a normal weight." He still had sleep apnea, still had atrial fibrillation, and then almost died because he never bothered to ask his doctor for a follow-up sleep study to see if he needed the treatment anymore or not. Lesson here: always follow up, especially if suddenly you think you're healthy. I'd have to go with vaccines cause autism, but I really want to tell another story that goes in a bit of a different direction. I had Asperger's and had a difficult childhood because of it. It was clear that something was different in first grade when I solved math assignments way faster than everyone else, but also had no friends and no one really liked me, and I did some weird stuff during school time when I had finished my assignments. So my mother went to several experts with me and all of them immediately said it was ADHD and wanted to give me some prescription for it. My mother started doubting them because they seemed to jump to the conclusion pretty quickly. So she read a lot about ADHD, and this part is really faking important, because if you doubt experts you better have a solid base of knowledge to do so. And it turned out, while some of the symptoms were things I did, but overall it didn't really fit at all. So we went to several other experts until one finally suggested Asperger's. Then my mother started reading a lot about Asperger's, and it seemed to fit. And there was a book that said one of the most common misdiagnoses people with Asperger's get is ADHD. So she had me tested, and it turned out she was right. From there, we could start develop strategies together and tell my teachers about it in order to deal with it. And now I'm close to getting a bachelor's degree in mathematics, which I wouldn't even have gotten the chance to if we'd have gone with the ADHD pills. I hope you all understand what I'm trying to say, because English isn't my native language, and I suck at things like that. I guess the moral is that, while experts are right most of the times, it isn't always wrong to doubt them. However, only do so if you have a good reason and some kind of proof or a base of knowledge. I know what's best for my child, for example, is not what I mean. Look for articles and books from credible sources and authors, and I love my mom. Oh my goodness, I have had medical doctors to deal with and specialists for so long I could tell so many stories of doctors screwing up and nearly killing me. A couple times my mother saved me because she knew how to put her foot down. Once it was when she didn't trust the first opinion of one doctor and took me to the second. The opinions were drastically different. The first doctor wanted to put me on the pill and the second doctor ended up doing exploratory surgery the next day to find a huge abscess that was in my abdomen attached to an ovary that would have burst and caused me to become septic and possibly die. Another time I had severe lupus and the doctors had me in the emergency room and really didn't think anything much was going on with me and were just ignoring me and going to send me home, and my mother hollered in the middle of the emergency room that someone needed to see me now or I was going to end up dead. At that point I was so miserable from suffering for so long I had just given up. I felt like no one cared. That woke them up, and so they did tests on me and confirmed that I was in kidney and liver failure. There was also the time that I had a kidney biopsy and afterwards they prescribed a sedative to me, but I always took a very low dose, only 1 milligram was plenty. I looked in my hand at what they gave me and it was 10 times the amount of what it was supposed to be. The doctor had forgotten to put the decimal point between the 1 and the 0 on my chart. I freaked out and instinctively hit all the medication out of the nurse's hand without even thinking about what I was doing, and they had to scramble and find all the pills on the floor. Lol. That would have been equivalent to a triple dose of horse tranquilizer to me at the time, as I only weighed about 110 pounds. I suppose that's a bit off topic if you want to talk about people taking matters into their own hands when they shouldn't. I had a friend that was a really pretty girl and very insecure because she had a disfigurement on her face from a childhood illness. When she was only around 12 years old she'd had a small growth in her gums. And I guess the dentist or the doctor felt that it was something serious and she needed some type of immediate treatment, but the mother decided to take her to Mexico for an alternative treatment because she didn't want them cutting her daughter apart. They went to Mexico for the alternative treatment, and it was a disaster. She finally had to give in and bring her daughter back for treatment, and was arrested for taking her daughter out of the country and not following doctor's advice. My friend ended up having half her cheek removed, and they had to replace the flesh with a piece of flesh from her back that was a different texture, hairiness and color from her regular skin on her face, and I believe they took out part of her jaw too and replaced it with something, I suppose. You could tell that she was not normal. She had problems because of all she'd been through, and also she was very paranoid about her appearance, and it had made her into a really superficial person in a strange way. She was still going to plastic surgeons well into her late 20s trying to fix what had been done to her face. Edited for spelling and punctuation. My grandfather, though he's still alive. He came from rural Germany to the US in the 1950s. I have never seen him drink anything other than coffee, beer, champagne, and whiskey, the latter two very rarely. This includes in hot environments. Vegas? He drank coffee. From McDonald's. And champagne. He had gallbladder problems for years, but no proper diagnosis, because he wouldn't go to a doctor, which he treated by drinking castor oil and whiskey until he passed out on a cruise, and they found it via exploratory surgery. By the way, this was caused by extraintestinal growth because of kidney cancer, which God only knows how they found, because he won't go to a doctor. He used to work with industrial chemicals, had the kidney removed and refused further treatment. This was nearly 40 years ago now. He has HBP, not severe but high enough, so he treats this with coffee, a clove of garlic and several teaspoons of honey in the morning instead of his medicine. Flu shots. What's that? He gets sick and says it's dust in his eyes, eats absolute complete garbage, and so does my grandmother. Cakes and free stuff they get from a food pantry. They're basically rich, but too cheap to buy clothes, so apparently they think they're poor. Everyone is always a crook, a cheat, a nasty fin politician, F this and F that. He goes to the doctor not for ill ailments, but because he believes his heels are too round. Still cuts his grass with a push mower, just turned 89. Still remembers remote obscure details from when he was in grade school. Doctors are amazed that he's as healthy as he is. Had a friend who got bad advice from the breast is best crowd after having her first child. They had her so convinced that formula was poison and that breast milk was the only option that she wouldn't even consider supplementing with formula. Despite me telling her it was not normal for her baby to want to eat every 20 minutes for 20 to 40 minutes at a time and cry constantly to be fed. But I'm obviously not a mother, despite having worked as a nanny and taken 2 years of early childhood development at a NAEYC accredited program. They told her this was perfectly normal and that she was cluster feeding. She realized something was wrong when she took her monthly picture and she looked skinny in comparison to previous pictures. Took her to the doctor, and at around 4 to 5 months old she weighed less than she did when she was born. Turns out my friend was not producing enough breast milk and her baby was not cluster feeding like the Leslie idiots claimed. The baby was literally starving to death 2 weeks on formula, and she was at a healthy weight for her age again. Had she waited even another week, that baby would probably be dead. And Leslie is always touted as a great knowledgeable source for the breastfeeding mother. They're anti-formula Nazis who just want to push their agenda, and they don't care if a baby dies for that to happen. I'm a little late, but here goes. This happened to me 2 years ago after a 11-day camping trip. Symptoms was dizzy, falling over, running into walls, super confused and tired half the time, also with lower back pain. Of course I waited a couple weeks to see if I got better to avoid the hundreds of dollars it would cost. It got the point where I couldn't really drive from having double vision and confusion, so I went to a doctor. I told her all about it and all of the things I had been looking up to try to figure it out. She told me I have valley fever from some reaction to the plants and spores in the area I had been camping. I go to get my prescription and I find out she never thought I had valley fever and actually diagnosed me with a mental disorder called somatic symptom disorder, which used to be like being called a hypochondriac. She didn't give me a prescription, but instead referred me to a mental health professional. I did not go, but had to wait another week to go to a reputable doctor, and it turns out I had 2 of the things I had guessed, which was a severe respiratory infection and an untreated urinary tract infection which could have spread to my kidneys any day. Seriously, fuck that lady, lying to my face to get me out of sight, then having someone else tell me I'm mentally ill and was making it all up. I got my real prescriptions and have been fine ever since. I've got another one. My ambulance was dispatched for a hospital-to-hospital transport, a typical BS non-emergency call. Patient was non-compliant with treatment for diabetes and didn't take her insulin. She developed ulcers on her feet that wouldn't heal, side effect of not controlling her diabetes. We call it Beta's feet. I talked to her nurse and explained we didn't have a good reason for transport. Her vitals were stable and she was capable of riding in a wheelchair van or getting a ride from family. I'm not committing Medicare fraud. Turns out the hospital itself was paying for this trip. She was a chronic drug seeker, had been hitting every hospital for painkillers, was well known among local heirs. She didn't have healthcare, so she was being taken to a crappy rehab clinic. She knew this and didn't want to go, had a habit of faking a seizure, so crews would take her to another See, the patient was still fairly young, maybe 40, and had been working professional. She was well down the path of homelessness, she lost her career, and didn't seem like there was any family helping her, but she was obviously educated, had nice things. All this combined with, but I'm guessing, was some mental illness meant she didn't believe she was sick at all. Seemed like she couldn't be bothered to manage her diabetes, also didn't like her doctors. She was convinced they had it out for her, and wouldn't give her medicine. She seemed to think painkillers would heal her. This is all highly irregular, but I had stuff in writing, so let's do this. Halfway to the crappy facility she fakes a seizure. During the seizure I ask her where she'd like to go. She answers. I remind her that people having seizures don't usually talk. I'll let her know we can redirect to an but they are not giving her drugs. She tells me to fuck myself and let's go to the clinic. So we are getting her checked in, and she's just being miserable. I'd had enough, so I broke it down for that she's already losing sensation in your feet and has sores that won't heal. That odds are she's going to lose those feet in a few years, and that the amputations will just keep coming. That it would be a wise idea to get clean off opiates and keep your feet. I don't think anybody's been that direct with her. I doubt it sank in, but it did stop her running her mouth. So my mom has heart disease, high blood pressure, cholesterol, had to get heart surgery before. For whatever reason doesn't trust doctors. Her sister / my aunt is this pseudocious natural health freak. Convinces my mom to go off of her prescribed medications and take some natural herbs and supplements instead. Her doctors, nurses, and myself all urge her not to. I spend hours explaining to her how each prescription medication acts on the body and how it helps. She swears up and down she feels better taking this herbal shit instead. A few months go by, my mom moves to a different state. Eventually I get a call from several random hospital over there, and it turns out mom had a stroke. I was both devastated and not surprised at all. Mom somehow ended up okay despite going to the hospital pretty late into her stroke. She didn't want to go, but a different relative called an ambulance for her, and she is mad that her sister got her to go off her original prescriptions, since they may have prevented the stroke by keeping her health in line. Anyway, people, please trust your healthcare providers, within reason at least. If you can't do that, learn how to research information from legitimately reliable sources to form an educated opinion on their advice. Keyword, reliable. As in reliable to be anything other than reliably bullshit. My grandfather had a series of mini strokes and stroke symptoms for 2 days. My grandmother, perpetuating old wives' tales and herbal remedies from the village in the motherland, told him to suck on a lemon and it will all go away. My father picked him up the next morning for his regular checkup at the hospital. He had a major stroke in the waiting room. If not for the fact that he was already in the hospital, he certainly would have died. He spent the last 7 years of his life requiring full-time care, a huge burden for my mother and grandmother who was not physically able to provide all the care he needed. The last 3 of those years in a nursing home. Before his stroke he was still driving, still mobile, happily retired and tending to his garden of superfruits and vegetables, the size of which had to be seen to be believed. After his stroke he was a defeated man, seemingly accepting that this would be how he died. 7 years was too long to live like this, and I know he would have tried to kill himself if he was physically able to. Unfortunately, this sheet will always be around. I know young mothers with young children doing the whole no vaccine, organic everything, free-range child thing. And all I can hope for is that at some point they see that the people most qualified to help you are trying to do just that. Years ago it was an educated villagers boiling down herbs and praying the disease away. Now it's fear-mongering on the internet. The best skill anyone can teach their kids in the information age is critical thinking and research. Maybe then we can end the idiocy. I'm really late to the party, but this is the chance I've been waiting for to tell people about my crazy aunt. She has 4 kids, the second youngest of which is mildly autistic. She's always been convinced that he is sick due to the usual BS excuses, required vaccination, government trying to poison us, etc., and she's tried to cure him and the family in so many ridiculous ways. Off the top of my head, here's a list of some of her crazy I know better than the doctor antics/theories. She put her whole family on a fruit diet for a few weeks. Don't remember the reasoning. No vegetables, no grains, straight up sugary fruit. I remember her texting my mom to brag about how great her kids' pups had become. A couple weeks later, all the kids had become horribly sick and were begging for real food. She took them to the doctor because she simply couldn't understand what was wrong with them. They'd been eating so healthily. /s. I should add that she did not participate in the fruit diet herself, but instead went out to eat sushi and such with my mom, while cracking down on the rest of the family at home. My mom tried to take my Asperger's brother ice skating, by his request. One of his favorite hobbies. Crazy aunt said that she shouldn't take him ice skating because he is trying to stimulate his vagus nerve and she needs to get him this special ear clip instead. Still don't really understand that one. Everyone in the US is afflicted with Lyme disease to some degree because of GMOs and pesticides, but are almonds, a different variety to the almonds we know, cure cancer but have been banned by the US government. Obama still secretly sources and eats them, but doesn't want us to know. Countless other stories. I'll add to this comment if I remember more. She moved the family to Mexico after encountering some problems with CPS in the US, so there are few limitations to her level of crazy. I worked in an old people's home years ago that admitted a couple that were both quite disabled. The man had no real mobility at all and was catheterized. After the first couple of weeks he started demanding to have his genitals washed and would moan and groan while you were doing it. Of course his skin started to break down from being washed so frequently, and the nurses had to speak with him about it. He wasn't interested. We were all told to be firm with him and to refuse to wash him unless he was dirty. He threw a fit, which in his case meant pressing the buzzer constantly all day and night. His wife also acted out on his behalf by deliberately pulling herself out of the carer's grasp while she was being assisted, causing herself injury. The man settled down for a short while, but then started demanding the nurses change his catheter. He would press the buzzer at 10-minute intervals all day and night. Many of the residents had very disturbed sleep patterns that exacerbated their own conditions. The man refused point blank to be reasonable. Nothing anyone said made any difference to him. After repeatedly being pulled back from the brink of death, he would go back to demanding washes and his catheter changing. His wife got a concussion from falling because she refused to cooperate and never really recovered before dying. He got repeated infections, repeatedly treated, and as soon as he was feeling well again would start buzzing constantly. He eventually died. It was pointed out to me that both of them had been using the staff for sexual gratification. When the woman had been mobile, the only time she voluntarily moved was when her husband was being cleaned/catheterized. She would get out of bed/chair and go over to his bed to watch. He'd be groaning while washed/catheterized, and she'd be groaning after she'd watched him having it done. She would always indicated that she needed the toilet, then groan while you were cleaning her. I'm late to the party and this will probably get buried, but here goes. My mother-in-law has multiple sclerosis. She was diagnosed 30 years ago and has been bedbound for about 20 to 25 years. My husband said when she was first diagnosed that she didn't do any of physical therapy, that she should have to keep her mobility high. Now she's totally reliant on my father-in-law, who is the kindest man, but to a fault, and she has been fighting 3 different stage 4th pressure ulcers, bed sores, for about 15 months now. Fun fact, they should be healed by now. Her mental capacity is questionable, since manuscript is not so nice to the brain either, so she tells my Phil that she doesn't want to turn because it hurts her sides or her trach. She has a trach because she went septic with her last major hospital stay and had to have a supplemental airway or she would have suffocated or whatever, as long as she doesn't have to take her eyes off the TV. so he doesn't turn her. He bought a special mattress that circulates air and relieves pressure on her buttocks all day long. Still can't convince them that she still needs to turn every 2 to 3 hours to remove pressure completely. She wants a shower. He puts her in a Hoyle lift, hydraulic lift that moves immobile people in a harness with ease out of their hospital beds and into a wheelchair, shower, etc., which exacerbates all of the bed sores and opens up any new healing. She wants her sheets changed. He puts her in the Hoyle lift. She finally agrees to lay on her side. 10 minutes later she's screaming for him to turn her back over. Honestly, we've gone over this and over this with them, but they will not listen to us. The home health nurses, the doctors, anyone who knows about pressure ulcers. My husband confronted his father about it one time and he looked at both of us and said, "The doctor said we didn't have to do any turning." I was dumbfounded. I work in healthcare, and I knew that no doctor worth his salt would ever say that about pressure ulcers. After that my husband and I just kind of gave up. We can't force them. We are at a loss. I don't know what else to do. I have folliculitis on my back. If you squeeze it, a stinky oily substance comes out. It doesn't hurt, not even when you squeeze it. However, if you squeeze it when it's recovering from being squeezed, then it hurts. The first time it happened was December 2015. I lay down on my back and a lot of the stinky oily substance came out. I went to the doctor and was prescribed antibiotics. I took the full course of antibiotics and it worked for the time being. The folliculitis came back July 2016. My brother enjoyed squeezing it because so much came out. My doctor told me to keep it clean because antibiotics didn't work in the long run. My doctor also told me not to squeeze it. It came back again on November 2017. I told my brother not to touch it, but I'm just bad at convincing people of anything. So he went ahead and squeezed it. At least he wiped the area with alcohol and cleaned his hands. In fact, this is what he told me. "You eat healthily and I don't, yet you have folliculitis and I don't. You took antibiotics and that didn't work. You kept it clean and that didn't work. So you might as well just let me squeeze it, since everything the doctor told you to do has failed. You can't deny that your folliculitis comes back, no matter what you do." It came back March 2018. This time, I asked him to video it for my YouTube channel, because I knew that I can't stop him from squeezing it. You can watch the video here. He also told me, not even wiping the area with alcohol and squeezing with clean hands can stop your folliculitis, so why should I bother doing that this time? After the March 2018 video, he decided to add insult to injury, or rather, injury to insult. He spited the doctor's orders by refusing to clean the area with alcohol and spreading the stinky oily substance all over my back. I immediately went for a shower and cleaned the area meticulously, but I bet that the folliculitis will come back, perhaps in more places, because my brother spread the stinky oily substance all over my back. Like too many of the answers here, homeopathic remedies killed my mom and aunt. My mom had been diagnosed with lung cancer. She waited years and took remedies that my very well-meaning but easily fooled aunt gave her, like honeybee extract and a giant box of other miracle cures. When I found out the diagnosis at 22, I made her go get real treatment. It was too late and it had spread to bone and breast. She died a painful and slow death that I took care of her through until she died when I was 26. 10 years later, that same aunt who I loved possibly more than I did, my mom, died to heart failure, horribly slow and painfully, while I held her hand and sat by her bed for 4 months. She had congenital heart failure and had decided that the doctors knew nothing, so refused to take any Western poison. Instead she took red bean protein, which she insisted was a miracle cure. The doctors kept telling her it wasn't working and she needed to take her meds. Unfortunately she agreed far too late and we couldn't do anything. She was naive, far too naive. She lost her life savings 3 times in her life to scams, and she believed in healing crystals and ancient medicine. She always believed that modern medicine was poison, and she died so badly. I lost both of these important people to this thinking, and I may have a thing against holistic healing because of it. I dropped my neurologist of 12 years without hesitation because he suggested some natural treatments for my manuscript. Fuck that sheet. Aspirin is just willow tree bark with the useless sheet removed. You want me to take a natural remedy, you better put it in a studied and verified pill or injection, because almost all of medicine has already gone through the ancient remedies and what works we sell. Greed assures big pharma will keep me alive. They make more and get more power for every cure they sell, and healthy people are insanely more valuable to insurance companies than sick people. I broke my foot in December, went to the had a boot put on. I was home for Christmas break, so I went to see the specialized broken bones doctor who told me I didn't need to have surgery and the bone should heal on its own. Flash forward 2 months later, was still having pain and not able to walk on it like I should have been. X-rays show my bone is still broken and CT scan shows there has been little to no healing. My doctor at college recommended surgery to have the bone taken out, but my mother wanted me to go home to do it. I'm in college 5 hours away because it is cheaper. She works at the hospital. Went to see the doctor, the same specialized broken bone doctor from the beginning, and he looked at my x-rays for 2 minutes then decided that I had pulled my tendon. Refused surgery and said, if it still hurts in 6 months come back and we will look at it again. Tried to put me on Lyrica. I decided that I wanted one more opinion because I had 2 conflicting ones and went to another doctor in the town over. He took x-rays and agreed I needed surgery. After the surgery was done, I was told my tendon had multiple tears in it which was causing a lot of the inflammation and pain I was having along with the huge amounts of scar tissue. Has been 4 months now and I'm finally starting to walk like normal again with no pain. I can't imagine having to go on 6 more months of the pain I was in, or what it would have done to my foot in the long run. Sometimes the doctors really don't know. I have a small branch of the family tree that live in Australia, an aunt and her husband and 2 adult kids. They are all cuckoo, believe vaccines cause autism and doctors are in the pockets of big pharma, all that. I distinctly remember when my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer 16 years ago, she did surgery/chemo/radiation and has been in remission since. My uncle gave her some book on preventing cancer through diet and basically told her it was her fault she got it. A couple weeks ago my 35-year-old cousin went to the hospital after 4 days of total constipation and severe abdominal pain. Turned out he has a 5-6 centimeter obstruction in his bowel, since confirmed to be adenocarcinoma, colon cancer. Initial tests suggested it had metastasized to the liver already, and may have also affected a handful of other organs. He had a very invasive biopsy. Reportedly they cut him open from collarbone to groin, but they did not remove the mass. You know where this is going. He's considering not doing chemo because they've read studies and doctors' accounts of patients healing themselves. My dad's asked repeatedly if they've determined the stage yet and yesterday was told they don't do that in Australia. My Aussie friend begs to differ. They say things like the oncologist says there's no hurry because he wants to wait 2 to 3 weeks for him to heal completely before starting chemo. Oh, and they took like 5 samples and only 1 was cancerous, so it's not that bad. Our shared grandfather died of colon cancer, by the way. Oh, and this cousin has a 9-month-old daughter. I'm just waiting for this story to end like Steve Jobs or many of the other more depressing ones in this post. My dad had a really minor stroke. My mom wanted to call an ambulance. When my dad couldn't get up off his chair after dinner one night he refused, decided to try to sleep it off, woke up next morning and his left side was even weaker but still refused. My mom had to call me to drive out to their house and forcibly take my dad to the doctor. He wouldn't go to the hospital. We get to the doctor's office and the machine that takes his blood pressure returns an error, and he turns to me really calmly, like it's an everyday thing, and he says, oh, that happens because the blood pressure is really high. He said some number but I forget, like 240 or something. I was like, what the fuck? The doctor of course immediately tells me to get him to the hospital and writes us a letter so the triage nurses know that my dad needs priority. I drive him over there, and the whole time my dad insists he's fine, even though his left leg is basically non-functional at this point and his left arm can only lift like halfway up. Luckily the stroke was really minor. It was so small a CAT scan didn't find it, so they had to do an MRI later, but he's been in rehab for like 2 months now. He's getting better, but slowly. I'm 100% positive that had he gone to the hospital right when it happened he would be so much better off. Minimal rehab. Essentially he didn't get to the hospital till 12 or 14 hours after the stroke happened. I think the worst part was during his hospital stay he kept refusing to his blood pressure medication cause he thinks he knows better. Eventually the nurses just forced him to. This is more of case of I know better than your doctors and I know you better than you know yourself. I have a fantastic cocktail of mental disorders, the usual ones, MDD, anxiety, and ADHD, that have been diagnosed by multiple professionals. The severity of my disorders lead me to be put on medicine for them, but my uncle wasn't having it. He pulled me aside one day and told me that I was over-medicated and my real problem was that I didn't get enough exercise. Which is true, I didn't at the time, but that was a separate issue, or that I was lazy and my diet was bad. He failed to realize that my depression had been so bad months before without my medication that I had dropped out of high school since I couldn't go anymore. I nearly didn't finish 11th grade. He failed to realize that I had a panic attack nearly every day because of horrible anxiety that caused me to full on rock back and forth and not leave my house or bathe for weeks at a time. Since getting on my medication, I was able to get myself to community college every day, go to work, bathe regularly, and I lost weight since I was no longer binge eating. Things weren't perfect, and I'd relapse only a couple months later, and then again a year after that. My depression gets really bad in the spring, but without the medication I wouldn't have been able to function. My mother refused to get me mental health treatment despite my begging for it, and I nearly killed myself when I was 16. I didn't get treatment until I begged my father over and over again, and he saw me rocking back and forth during a panic attack. Even then, no one believed I was really sick until a diagnostic test revealed I was 17 points over the minimum for severe major depressive disorder. My therapist asked me how I managed to function as well as I did, and I honestly didn't know. Even after the diagnostic, my mother doubted me and questioned my medication. It wasn't until she witnessed my agoraphobia and oversleeping firsthand that she realized something was terribly wrong. Despite numerous medical professionals telling my family that I need this to survive, people still think they know better. They still think I'm just being lazy, and they can't comprehend that mental illnesses are real. My father had a sister who was born with a disability no one in the family was ever really specific about, but then again this was during the late 1940s into the early 1950s when that sort of thing wasn't nearly as well understood as it is now. She was ill and spent her life in hospital-like settings until she died. Based on that experience, my father, his parents and his brothers and sisters all developed a deep distrust of the entire medical profession. After suffering a relatively mild heart attack, my father, heavy smoker and drinker, was diagnosed with liver disease and the early stages of cancer. Unsure of specifics, he never told anyone, not even his wife. Despite his obvious deterioration, he refused all pleas and all advice and never saw a doctor again until he finally collapsed and ended up in the ICU where he later died. His brother died from cancer after quitting chemo and visiting a Mexican faith healer. 2 of his sisters died from cancer after getting diagnosed and doing nothing about it. He passed on that distrust to my sister too, who collapsed in a crowded park, angrily refused treatment, and died of a heart attack a week later. It gets worse. My mother, who had no problem with modern medicine in general, took a fall some years back and struck her lower back. She had my sister drive her to the ER to get checked out. The x-rays were negative, but she was advised to stay overnight and get an MRI in the morning to ensure there was no bone damage. My sister angrily proclaimed this was all a scam and mom was fine and eventually badgered her into going home. The tiny hairline fracture in her vertebrata apparently wasn't much of a problem for mom. I didn't even know about her fall or her visit until years later, as my sister felt it was best to not worry me over the next several years until it finally became a much bigger fracture which ended up leaving her effectively paralyzed from the waist down. My 77-year-old father is one. He had a total hip replacement over 10 years ago because he'd abused his hip joint during his life and had literally no cartilage left. 2 years ago he got an infection and was hospitalized so they could surgically drain the area. and he was put on antibiotics for 2 months. Had to be in long-term care facility because of the antibiotics. He told us afterward that he had been feeling ill for a month or so before we took him to the ER. Fast forward 6 more months, and he's not feeling well again. He limps when he walks and seems to have visible pain. Finally my mother convinces him to go back for a checkup, and the infection is back. This time, they have to remove the prosthesis because it's clearly harboring the infection. They insert a medical cement, not industrial grade, spacer, and he's again put on antibiotics. He saw a physician for follow-up care, but kept refusing to schedule the surgery to replace the hip prosthetic because he has trouble with the anesthesia. The infection plus anesthesia in 2016 seems to have accelerated his dementia. He did agree once, went in for the surgery, and they screwed up by not having enough blood of his type on file for a transfusion. If he needed it, he was sent home. He hasn't rescheduled. He has visible pain in his leg when walking. He often limps. The spacer is clearly intended as a temporary measure. Sometimes patients aren't even able to walk with them in, but he assumes it's going to last forever, and he's constantly surprised when his leg is painful and acts up. I really don't want to witness him falling down the stairs or having another accident because his leg gave way. A slight different take on this story because it is an instance of a patient thinking they are better than 2 different health professionals, a doctor and a pharmacist. In my country, scabies treatment can be obtained behind the counter at the pharmacy after pharmacist assessment. This is my coworker's story. A man approached the counter asking for this scabies treatment. My coworker, the pharmacist, started to assess if this was the appropriate treatment for him, and the man stated he thought he had scabies, but the doctor disagreed, since the lesions he was complaining about were on his face. Scabies lesions do not appear on the face, so that was an automatic sign that this wasn't scabies. The pharmacist agreed with the doctor and said that it's probably some nicks or irritation from shaving. The patient started screaming, claiming he knew it had to be scabies, and threatening the pharmacist. The pharmacist said, "If you don't calm down, I can't help you. I have to call security." The man called the pharmacist on his bluff and the pharmacist shrugged, called security, and he was dragged out of the drugstore, screaming bloody murder, and was promptly banned from the store. An hour or so later, the man came back, escorted by security, waving around a tube of the scabies treatment, laughing at the pharmacist, saying he got the treatment from another pharmacist. This guy literally asked to be escorted in security, just to laugh in the pharmacist's face that he got what he wanted finally. I guess you mean when the patient was wrong, but I guess to me, the worst case was the Lyme disease misdiagnosis I experienced. I was bit by a tick, removed it myself, and I considered it solved. A few weeks later, I was sick with flu-like symptoms. I went to the doctor, told them about my tick bite, and was given meds for the nausea and headache, and I was told it was probably a summer flu. After a shitty few days, I felt a bit better and resumed work renovating my house. It was July, and I took my shirt off because it was hot, and my wife came up to help. She immediately saw the bullseye marks, a common Lyme disease indicator. I go back to my doctor the next day to show them my findings, and they just leave me sitting in a room for about an hour. The guy comes back and says we are not sure what's wrong. I say something like it's okay to tell me it's Lyme disease if that's what you think it is, and his reaction was clearly an astonished one, and he leaves the room again to consult with whomever. Another long while later, he comes back to say they think it's Lyme disease, and they give me some crazy antibiotics. I've been fine ever since, and this happened in 2010 or so, but I certainly have to wonder what they were so afraid of. Was it simply the threat of a malpractice lawsuit? Did they really not consider Lyme disease? If the outcome were anything other than positive, I guess I'd be up their ass, but since I have been fine, I haven't tried to cause any undue trouble. This one involves a doctor being a dickhead, so some basic info. My FMIL, future mother-in-law, is about 60 to 70 years old and diabetic. Well, the doctor she'd been seeing didn't really do anything for her other than ask you okay good, no exams, didn't check her feet, etc. Everything you have to check for diabetics. Didn't even recommend / tell her to change her diet, just prescribed her meds. So she'd been having bathroom issues, bloody stool at first, then constantly feeling the urge to poop followed by filling the toilet with blood. She goes to this doctor and he says oh it's probably just hemorrhoids, doesn't check her, doesn't get x-rays, nothing. So finally her sons and I convinced her that this doctor is going to kill her if she keeps listening to him. So she gets a different doctor and makes an appointment. Guys, turns out she has lower intestinal tract / rectal cancer, and even after all this the damn stupid doctor refuses to turn over her records to the new doctor and keeps trying to get her to come back. Fuck that noise. She's been getting treatment with this new doctor, chemo and radiation. She's really tired and keeps having to get fourth put in cause she gets dehydrated, plus actually had to get a blood transfusion, but that's faking hard cause she's got super rare blood type. Her old doctor has nearly killed people before, and probably legit has killed people before. He told Fiancé's paternal uncle he was fit as a fiddle, then uncle had a heart attack the next day. And what's even worse, there's more doctors like this. They're all bundled under a major hospital company. Things I've seen these sheets do. I was in an emergency room and I saw them wheel in a woman that best I could tell was in a car accident. She had a huge head wound and was bleeding like crazy. They sat her in the hall and 3 hours later, when I left she was still there. I kept an eye on her those 3 hours, and no one checked on her at all. I went there another time for a spider bite that I had ignored and was regretting that. Bite location, ankle, swelled up, started weeping and felt hard. Then I had a reaction, hives. So I finally break down and get sent to the faking dumbass doctor there. Said it was poison ivy. I've had poison ivy reactions before, and it is not like this. He could even see the bite marks and just dismissed it. There's a different hospital about an hour from us. We, Fiancé's family and I, have all come to a pact. If one of us needs the hospital, don't call for an ambulance. They are owned by the faked up hospital company and will only drive you to them. We are to drive the person in need to the hours away hospital. We honestly have a better chance of surviving than if we are taken to that hellhole. Locals in the area feel the same way, as the corrupt hospital has let too many people just die without treatment or gave them such subpar treatment you might as well not go. That is, a friend broke his arm and went to the They glanced at it and said yeah, you better get that fixed. I'm not quite sure what you mean, but I will say I have a history of going to the same hospital. This is important because they should have had access to all my earlier records of me having severe back spasms. Back spasms are not fun. If you move or breathe any sort of different way, it feels like you're being stabbed. We are talking moving millimeters. You can't take deep breaths. The pain will knock you down before you can say boo. The last time this happened, I was doing laundry, moving wet clothes into the dryer. Top loader into front loader equals sort of a twisting movement. The back spasm hit me. I fell down and hit my head on the edge of the bathtub because that is where the washer / dryer was, and knocked myself out. When my honey found me once he got home and we went to the they said I had a UTI, urinary tract infection. I kept telling them I had had these back spasms before and always went to that same hospital, so they should have my records. No, they completely ignored me. So, they insisted I had a UTI and sent me home. I remember calling my regular doc and his office saying go back to the hospital. I finally did, but there were new people then. My non-existent UTI was really 2 fractured vertebrae and a cracked rib. Once they sent me to get a CAT scan. This was all due to my falling after my back went out. So anyway, to answer this thread's question, I knew my back had gone out. And I knew what had worked in the past equals a shot in my ass of Dilaudid and a few days worth of Flexeril. At the time, I knew I was in more pain, but I didn't realize the extent of the damage. Meanwhile, some faking nurse, because even after spending at least 4 hours in the that is likely all you will now see, gave me some other kind of shot in my ass, then about a half hour later asked if it did anything. No. What a mother faking cunt she was. My records were in their database. This was not rocket science, although more damage was done. When I fell. She treated me like some drug addict. I hope she burns in hell. It was a faking nightmare. I don't know if it counts, but when I was a kid, I had mild asthma. It was usually not much of an issue, but every once in a while I would develop a pretty bad cough, combined with asthma-like symptoms, that wouldn't go away for a few days. I apologize if that's an inaccurate description, because I have no clue what exactly it was. Around the age of 5 I had one of those, and my mother, who was a doctor, mind you, decided she would solve it by giving me Ventolin. But since it didn't really do much, she gave me some more, and then some more, and some more, and some more, and some more. At the evening of the same day, after being given full dosage Ventolin inhalations every 30 minutes, I was literally shaking uncontrollably, and was breathing very fast and very flat. My mother yelled at me that I was just faking it, and demanded that I stopped at once. My father finally convinced her that maybe, just maybe, something was wrong, and drove me to the point. I don't remember the exact details, but the doctor in the was bewildered. It was a huge overdose even for an adult, let alone a 5-year-old kid. Spent an entire week hospitalized, not for the original out of control asthma, just for the overdose. The best part? My mother actually denied the whole thing happened altogether. Good thing other people apparently have a slightly better memory. So quite a horrible story, but the only time I feel it's okay to share it. My mum suffered with a few pains in her chest and various little weird aches around her upper body, and the doctors were completely sure about it being from the novavirus. I think it was. Apologies, I cannot remember the specifics. This started escalating, and the chest pains started becoming very painful indeed to her. So back to the doctors again. Right, okay, they had a check and the summary was it's just a cold, a nasty one, but don't worry. They made an appointment to check up on her in like a week and a half. She gets home, and within 5 minutes of walking into the house, had a feeling the doctors were incredibly wrong, and phoned an ambulance. The paramedics arrived, to which she then stated her pain, my chest is hurting really bad and I think I'm going now. She dropped to the floor suffering a massive heart attack. Her heart stopped for a couple of minutes, and luckily the paramedics were there, aware of what was happening, almost instantaneously brought her back to life. She died for around 3 minutes and now cannot work, cannot drive, has ongoing heart failure issues, and due to her brain being starved of oxygen, has issues with memory, and her benign tremor she had in her hands now appears as if she is holding a power drill constantly. If it wasn't for her instinct of just ignoring the doctors, knowing they were wrong, and also ignoring myself, and her husband's advice of yeah I'm sure you'll be fine, my mum wouldn't be here right now. A close call, but honestly people don't always rely on the docs, trust yourself sometimes too. My aunt. Let me be clear, when I say I had 4 different doctors be unable to diagnose me, and she insists she knows what it is, and has a cream for it, and I went to Disney World, where lots of foreigners frequent. They can potentially bring in illnesses that my body isn't familiar with in my area, rashes I've never seen, etc. I stood in line for 2 hours between a Spanish-speaking family and an Arabic-speaking family for a ride at DW. Both families exhibited signs of being sick. The Spanish-speaking family was actively giving their child cough syrup through a syringe in line. The Arabic-speaking family was itching constantly. Within the next couple of days I had a sinus infection and a bizarre rash with hives from head to toe. No fever throughout any of this. I had diarrhea and non-stop itching with hives for 3 weeks. I went to the 4 times in total over these 3 weeks. My aunt 100% insisted that it was simply allergies and nothing else. She was in total denial that it could possibly be a rare virus or combination of things. Her doctors were baffled and gave me prednisone and some creams and pills for itching. Nothing worked. I'm still sick to this day, still in full body hives and itching, but the sinus infection is gone. I'm no longer in the state and I've never had allergies before. I know it can start at any time, but I'm not exhibiting the usual signs anyways. She is 100% dead set on the fact that I'm just allergic to pollen, and it couldn't possibly be anything else. I'd like to top this story off with a cherry. 4 other people in our Disney trip, 4 out of 11 people, now have the same rash/hives, except this disappeared in 48 hours. Jesus, I have 2 different stories. First one, my mom. My mom was almost officially diagnosed with bipolar disorder by her doctor. She refused to believe it, said the doctor was wrong, said the doctor knew nothing, and was out to ruin my mom's life. The other one was an old lady I was taking care of. Background for her: she was an older lady like 85, who was born and raised in Boston area, and was extremely hard-headed. I'm not talking cute little old lady stubbornness, I mean she literally got kicked out of the hospital for not listening to the doctors, walked out by police. Anyway, before I left her as a client, she had abnormal bleeding somewhere in her, where every week, and had to go into the hospital for 4 hours to get a blood infusion. All of her doctors suggested she needed to do a colonoscopy to see where the blood was going. They figured the bleeding was somewhere in her GI tract. She refused to let them do it. Told them they were wrong. They suggested next a camera that goes down her throat and her stomach, which is basically the same thing, but easier for elder people. She refused that as well. She doesn't think she has a bleed anywhere, but yet always said, "Where is my blood disappearing to?" I don't know the rest of the story. I gave up, sadly. I couldn't spend most of my days trying to convince her that the doctors were right, and she wanted to stop the infusions. She should listen to them. I heard months later that the hospital she went to told her she wasn't welcome back. She was verbally abusive to almost all doctors' head. The jelly juice people. Essentially, this lady says she has a cure-all with the following: 1 TBSP salt, 2 cups cabbage, and 3 cups water, fermented for 3 days, and it is recommended for users to consume over a gallon of this stuff per day. That means roughly 40 BSP of salt per day minimum. She has also convinced her followers that the common symptoms of hyponatremia, too much salt in the body, is actually the part of the healing process, especially cloudy thoughts, abdominal pain, intense diarrhea, referred to by the users as waterfalls, and vomiting. Of course, thirst is also a symptom, which she just recommends people drink more. If all of the people taking this were consenting, healthy adults, that would be one thing. However, people are forcing this on their kids, and most people taking this aren't exactly healthy to begin with. It should be important to note that as little as 1 teaspoon of salt taken at once is enough to severely harm a child. She claims that she is working on a thesis study, yet has no medical or educational background, and is not attending any university or college. In order to join her group, originally a Facebook group, one of the requirements was that the participants not question her procedures or her qualifications. When people joined who would either take information about people forcing this on their kids, or having to be hospitalized to send to CPS, or to get enough information for a news story, she quickly moved to a site with a paid membership fee.